Why Africa remains so poor despite having more mineral wealth than the rest of the world combined? That is a very good question. This is by Willem Petzer. We're gonna look at this. To be fair, to be honest, I have my suspicions. One of them is obviously socialism, because as we can tell, this keeps countries very poor. Also, what I believe to be the case is corruption. There is a large amount of corruption in Africa. So that's also a major contributor. In fact, there's a good chance that the leftovers of colonization probably did more good than bad for Africa. We can see this, for example, when we look at Ethiopia, a country that had nothing to do with colonization at all, being in a not great state.
Africa is by far the poorest continent on planet Earth, and the poorest continent throughout history, despite having also by far the most potential. But Africa isn't just blessed with natural resources, it is also strategically the best positioned landmass on planet Earth. The continent sits at the crossroads of the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, right on the world's busiest trade routes. Beneath its soil lie by far the most of the metals that drive modern civilization. Gold, lithium, platinum, cobalt, manganese, rare earths, uranium, copper, iron, I could go on. It has 40% of the planet's arable land for agriculture, the largest solar energy potential.
I wasn't expecting the accent, and neither did I, but I like it, kinda. Here's also a thing when people say like, "Oh, right during colonization we stole all the resources." That is not true at all whatsoever. In fact, it was a small amount, because remember, when it happened, right? When it happened, we didn't have big machines to dig out stuff. That wasn't the case yet. So technically, theoretically, if provided the tools, and we are stuffing lots and lots of money into the development of Africa, theoretically, they should have a bajillion resources to access. For some odd reason, it doesn't happen. We build we give them money so they can build access to water. They don't do that. They don't do that. And if they do, or when others do it, it just gets left behind in a catastrophic state. It is insane. It is insane.
On planet Earth, enormous rivers and hydropower potential, vast natural gas and oil reserves, the second most in the entire Earth, just say for the Middle East.
I think this really just comes down to corruption as to why it is the way it is. I do think it comes down to corruption.
Colossal forests and the youngest population in the world. By every measurable economic standard, minerals, agriculture, energy, oceans, geography, and demographics, Africa should be an economic powerhouse. But the reality is that the exact opposite is happening in Africa. Africa's GDP per capita is 3 times less than the second poorest continent on Earth, Asia, and more than 30 times less than the wealthiest continent, North America. What makes things even worse is that when you compare only sub-Saharan Africa to other continents, the picture looks way more dire. Sub-Saharan Africa has far more economic potential than North Africa, which is essentially just one big desert. And yet, Sub-Saharan Africa's GDP per capita is not only 3 times less than...
Holy! Oh my god. North America in comparison to Sub-Saharan Africa is 46 times. It's even more than even North Africa has more. They haven't had enough centuries to fix their shit. They'll get there though. A few more decades. I'm gonna be honest. If this continues, China will own more in Africa than actual Africans, which is crazy. There is a good chance that in 10 to 20 years, China holds more power in Africa than Africans. Because it is already happening. Right? China's investing massively into Africa.
North Africa's, it is an astonishing 48 times less than North America and 44 times less than Australasia. If we take a broader and more holistic view of the matter, the overall development index for Africa looks just as bad when compared to other parts of the world. The Human Development Index takes into account everything from income to education and life expectancy. Here too, Africa ranks dead last, and it's not even remotely a close race. But why is it that Africa has always been so poor? And why has this always remained the case throughout history? In this video, we provide a full analysis of the economic reason why this continent continues to lag so far behind the others today. Yes, when Europeans started colonizing Africa in the 17th century, virtually all sub-Saharan African cultures were still living in the Stone Age. But ever since, they have equal access to the same technology the rest of the world enjoys. Yet, they still lag equally far behind that they did when they were still in the Stone Age. Africa has more economic potential than
Again, I do believe that due to the power differences in Africa, there's people who just hoard everything for themselves with no benefit for overall society. Again, I believe that socialism is a great contributor to why things are the way they are. That is what I've heard also from Africans saying that socialism is probably is the driving force as to why it is the way it is.
any other continent on the planet. In terms of just natural resources, Africa has the highest potential not only in terms of critical minerals, agricultural land and water, renewable energy, and it is second only behind the Middle East, as I mentioned, in oil and gas reserves. Yet, the real reason Africa ought to be wealthier than everywhere else goes beyond the minerals and the soil and the location. In an age where innovation, energy transition, battery technology, rare earth supply chains, advanced agriculture and renewable power define the global economy, Africa sits on the very inputs of whatever the world needs most to drive modern civilization. This continent is not simply very resource rich. It holds many of the raw materials for the next industrial revolution. And for many of these materials, Africa is one of the only...
Not only that, think about what Africa could achieve, what the entire continent could achieve, if they actually got their shit together and use the available manpower. Remember, it's a lot of people in Africa, a lot of people. They actually utilized, fun fact, child labor isn't even that, like, common, like, basically, of, like, children being forced into labor. Oftentimes, what happens in quite a few countries is that poor families ask if they can get their children to work. I've seen somebody who lives in Africa to elaborate this. That wasn't German, which is interesting. An African man that speaks German. So yeah, that is also oftentimes a misconception. It's not that children are being forced into, like, labor, it's that they have no other choice. The problem is that with the way socialism works, nobody who has a lot of money wants to invest there. The only places where investments happen is the more richer parts of Africa, while the more poor areas don't really get anything. Because Africa has quite a few great cities, big cities, modern cities. They're just the exception, not the majority.
Places where you can find them, or in the case of something like uranium, Africa has by far the most of this stock in the world, and this is a very rare resource found in not many countries. From cobalt to platinum group metals for green tech, from solar radiation levels unmatched on Earth to vast uncultivated fertile land mass, Africa has the kind of strategic economic field that Silicon Valley, Europe, and China would absolutely kill to have. Meaning, Africa should
In other words, Africa could have its own Wakanda. But for some odd reason, this is not happening.
not just compete with the richest regions in the world by rights, it should lead the world. The total value of all untapped minerals under the African soil is more than twice the rest of the world combined. Yet, it has never been the case that Africa came even close to the wealth of any of the other inhabitable continents, and most likely never will. African countries, especially after decolonization, have simply proven themselves incapable of utilizing this God-given potential to the way that the people of other continents have. And one of the core reasons for this is that Africa has never developed the much needed division of labor upon which true economic growth and civilization as a whole actually is built. While in the rest of the world there were agricultural revolutions which had led to commercial farming from the very dawn of humanity, this never happened in Africa. In Yuval Harari's groundbreaking book entitled Sapiens, A Brief History of Humanity, he highlights that agricultural revolutions took place since the very dawn of humanity all over the world, starting in ancient Mesopotamia as the cradle of humanity.
The great problem is, this man is a bit harsh, but it's true. The problem is that we essentially, with the colonization, ripped them out of the Stone Age. That's basically what a large portion of their happened, right? We ripped them out of the Stone Age. And as harsh as it sounds, due to them not having, right, the time to develop the way they would naturally do if they made all those discoveries on their own, right? We look at like all the high cultures, right? We look at like China, we look at like India, we look Europe overall, right? They have made like major developments. Like by the time these cultures met each other, they were already no longer, like, they were already further than people in Africa. So that might also be, they had less time because they didn't develop in that way. So I wonder if that has anything to do with it.
One of the hallmarks of these agricultural revolutions was the creation of commercial farming, surplus food production, and the
And there's also something harsh to say, which is that while we look at, right, don't use words like high, like the big empires, right? Africa never had that. And high cultures is a term that is used, for example, for the Persians, the Greeks, technically the Romans too, right? Those cultures, right? It's just a term for cultures that were in their time period at the absolute peak. The Aztecs, I don't think you pronounce it that way, right? Were also in that category.
Emergence of a stable, specialized society. Because once the most basic requirement for human activity, food, was taken care of by the farmers, this freed up the rest of the population to engage in other activities. In other words, instead of everyone laboring daily as hunters and gatherers just to survive the next day, the first commercial farmers ensured that there was a sufficient steady food.
Yeah, that's probably the main reason why they were in the Stone Age at one point. That's probably one of the major reasons. That's probably the main reason. Food is probably the main reason, yeah. Why they were so far behind. It'll probably take quite some time.
Supply, allowing the rest of the population to engage in other productive careers needed to further civilization. So, The first craftsmen, traders, administrators, soldiers, and even scholars emerged from early civilization. Africa never had commercial farmers. Africa never had the need to have commercial farmers, but we'll get to that later in the video. Commercial farmers are the first and foremost requirement to build civilization. Therefore, Africa could never build civilization. In regions such as Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, and later Europe, this early specialization process produced cities, irrigation systems, writing, mathematics, metallurgy, and trade networks. By contrast, Sub-Saharan Africa remained dominated by either subsistence herding or small-scale shifting agriculture for most of history, and also, of course, hunter-gatherer communities. These agricultural revolutions never took place in African tribal societies and never shaped the sub-Saharan African culture up until the arrival of European settlers around 400 years ago. The reason for this is quite simple. Africa is a very easy place to survive compared to a place like Europe, for example. In Africa, food is abundant just by nature.
Yep, that's the truth. It is very unlikely that in Africa you would in fact struggle for food, because when we look at what's going on, right? We can look at Europe. We have winters. Nothing grows. It makes sense that you would have agriculture to prepare for the winter. Africa never had that need, which makes sense. Yeah, that does make sense. Food is abundant in that way. What if someone goes back in time, change their route? Well, then, if that would happen, then Africa would be, the African countries would be Africa would be the leading continent in everything. If that were to be the case. Very likely. They would be the leading in technology, resources, probably food, export, easily. No question about it.
There's so many things growing in the fields and so many animals walking around that can be utilized for food that it wasn't necessary for Africans to ever develop their agricultural system. Furthermore, African winters are not harsh. Yes, it may become a little bit colder in winter than in summer, but the grass still grows. In many areas it still rains, plants still grow, and it never gets cold enough for people to die. In contrast, in many European countries, especially if you go more north in Europe to Germany, Scandinavia, etc., during winter, nothing survives. And if you do not prepare for winter, you die. During the summer months, you need to produce enough food, produce enough firewood or whatever you use to produce heat during the cold nights of winter. Otherwise, you'll die either of hunger or of the cold. Because Africa is such an easy place to survive, Africans never needed to do this. And in the process, they never had this division of labor where some people who were commercial farmers and produced food for the rest of society, and the rest of society could develop into other trades or into scholars, people who, for instance, developed a written.
And basically, since they never needed to have proper agriculture, they just focused on the hunter-gatherer societies, which in other words make nobody focus on other things like building like developing further ways in, for example, ways to live in, make better ways to hunt, experiment, other cultural things, right? They never needed to do that. That's probably the reason. If it all starts with agriculture, then that's a problem.
Language. If you have to hunt and gather all day just to survive the next day, you are not going to develop a written language. For example, if you do not have a written language, you do not have the means to produce philosophy and science and so on and so forth. It remains mind-boggling that European and Asian societies managed to create these complex civilizations characterized by highly advanced hydraulics, mechanics, surveying, architecture, literature, philosophy, many thousands of years before Africa had any alphabets or written languages. In fact, for sub-Saharan Africa, alphabets and written language had to be invented for them by European missionaries. This means
That likely also does not include the damage that slavery, not just like them selling their own people to white people, but also the Arab slave trade, how much damage that has done to the continent. Because remember, while slavery officially is banned, it still happens in Africa. So that's another thing that goes around.
that a culture that develops the intellect of its people over many generations was never formed in Africa because Africa never had farmers. One of the main economic reasons for this is that the very
It's also that should they make discoveries that would push them further into the future, into their development cycle, they don't have a language, a written language, right? They can't write it down. So if somebody would discover how to utilize metal, that wouldn't matter, because should this group die, then the knowledge is lost. That's usually the problem. If you don't have a written language, you cannot pass down knowledge. That's another thing. Is the Arab slave trade? Yeah, oddly enough, we always talk about what the white people did, but we do not talk about what they did. Weird.
basis for any kind of division of labor and growth in productivity is this successful commercial farming, something that has never been part of the African culture. In South Africa, in particular, it has been the descendants of the Dutch, French, and Germans, known as the Afrikaner or Boer people today, that have affected the much needed agricultural revolution in this.
Yep. Which is funny. So the Afrikaner, right? Which is really, really funny, right? They're white people. White Africans. They live there. They brought their stuff there originally, right? Then they were essentially kicked out of the broad space of, like, the countries, right? Took their stuff, built their own communities, and they are thriving. They are living their best life on this continent. They're doing incredibly well. Self-sustained as communities. You, by the way, cannot go there if you are not from there. Like, if you cannot go there if you're not one of the people, right? You cannot go there. They're completely isolated, yet they have the exact same resources that we have. Weird. And the exact similar way of living that we have. It is interesting. And since those people moved away, those regions, right, have started to fall apart. Because obviously, if you don't want me, I'm taking my stuff with me. Obviously. It's really interesting. It's really interesting to look at that and realize that this is a much greater problem than just white people at fault. That has nothing to do with that. And I do think that the only place that really suffered due to colonization is India on a financial level. They bled. But most places that were colonized actually benefited from it, especially the Aborigines in Australia. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. That culture was ruthless. That was an actual, like, grape culture. It's crazy. Before colonization. It's actually insane.
Part of the world since their arrival in the 16th century. From 1652 onward, the Cape of Good Hope witnessed the gradual emergence of European-style division of labor that always begins to reshape the region's economy. What started as a small refreshment station under Jan van Riebeeck rapidly expanded into a structured agriculture base and trading settlement. with Dutch, French, and later German settlers introducing systematic farming practices, viticulture, new livestock management techniques, and grain production, learning from one another to create this agriculture-based society. This resulted in a surplus production, which increased specialized roles such as millers, bakers, carpenters, cookers, blacksmiths, wagon builders, traders, administrative officials, etc., which lays the foundations for the diversified and interdependent economy required to establish civilization on the Dark Continent. This is how civilization was brought to South Africa. The Cape's location on a global trade route further accelerated this process of building civilization here at the southern tip of the Dark Continent. As the settlement became integrated into international supply networks, attracting merchants, artisans, and labor systems that together established the first sustained modern division of labor in all of Southern Africa for that matter. This complex or a little bit more complex economic structure, rooted in specialization and surplus agricultural production, set the stage for broader industrial and agricultural development in the region in the centuries that followed. As the voortrekkers moved inland, our ancestors established agricultural-based republics, which formed the necessary foundation for the development of the mining industry that eventually led to South Africa being by far the richest and most developed country on the African continent, richer and more developed even than any of the northern African countries. All of this wealth, which to this day benefits not only every person in this country, but the continent as a whole, came by virtue of the very people that the ANC government now persecutes and suppresses by means of discriminatory legislation, excluding white people from the labor market and threatening to expropriate our productive farmland that is feeding this continent currently without compensation. This is not justice or transformation. This is a political agenda that will destroy the very foundations of civilization in Southern Africa.
To be fair, I think that, like I said, most of African industry will be owned in some way, shape, or form by China. That is how I see it. I don't think that the future of Africans actually lies with Africans. I think that the future of Africans is a make or break essentially by China investing massive amounts of money into it, right? That's what it's gonna be, I'm assuming.
Our agricultural sector, via an attack upon the very industry that makes human progress and civilizational development possible in the first place, commercial farming. In a recent video, we highlighted the astonishing fact that despite all the rhetoric and noise from the radical Pan-Africanists left in South Africa, black South Africans actually already own more fertile farmland ripe for agricultural exploits, even per capita, than the citizens of any first world European nation. And yet, despite this fact, children starve to death in this country every day. Black South Africans, despite sitting on all of this very high potential agricultural land, in 2025 still didn't develop commercial farming. Watch that video by simply clicking on the link appearing on your screen right here. And remember to become a member of the Willem Petzer group. Just simply follow the...
That's pretty much it. That is pretty much it. Interesting. So basically what it comes down to is they never had the need for proper agriculture. So essentially they never developed the way we did. Because they never had, in this case, never had time to produce writing for science and math and other discoveries, right? Because if you only have food in mind the entire day, that's what you're gonna choose to do. Go get food, pretty much. That sums it up pretty well. And even with the tools provided that they have now, they still don't manage to do that. Though I think that's a lot more on the political climate in African countries than on Africans themselves. But that's pretty much what sums it up, is lack of agriculture, which in return led to a lack of having time to do anything but feeding yourself, pretty much. Anyways, like, comment, and subscribe.